Oh hi, I'm the Heretic. So what's going on with the video? Isn't Heretic one of those anarcho-capitalisms things? Why would he say we need a state? I admit, this is an especially unusual topic for me to talk about. I'm anti-government, aren't I? I mean, the first words in my first video are, statism is a religion. So am I backtracking after a year and a half? Am I backing down? Am I realizing that calling statism a religion doesn't actually describe statism in any meaningful way and cannot rationally be interpreted as a put-down? Well, just hear me out. You see, after reading some more Hans Hermann Hoppe and really digging into the material, I realized my understanding of government and the state were erroneous. Now don't get me wrong, I'm still anti-government, and I agree that a voluntary, stateless society is the most ethical society. That hasn't changed, but we need to get our priorities straight. Namely, that voluntarism is only possible thanks to thousands of years of Greco-Roman tradition developed over countless generations that facilitated the development of classical liberalism that eventually formed libertarianism. This tradition is unique in all the world, but don't take my word for it. Look at every other major social order in the world. They couldn't figure out first principles, let alone take it to its logical conclusion, libertarianism, which is completely understandable. After all, it took the West thousands of years to do it. But even then, that's no excuse. You see, while it took the West thousands of years to figure out, it doesn't take thousands of years to copy off our homework. They can easily learn from what we figured out and then apply it to their own societies, even improve on it. But they haven't. I mean, sure, there's some instances of freedom which make things better, even slightly, but the exceptions don't disprove the rule of the third world, and that rule is oppression and tyranny. Now why is this? How is it that other cultures can't see the prosperity even half-assed market economies have produced and want to replicate it? The answer is tradition. Cultural norms, desires, and preferences that drive individuals within that society, giving them purpose stronger than their desire for improvement of their material circumstances. Their cultures tolerate or even justify the rank oppression their governments force them to endure by offering something greater than themselves, a sense of unity with their neighbors and belonging in society, even if it ultimately leaves its people less well off. The power that these traditions have cannot be denied. Now this would be fine, but there's a problem. You see, who is and is not allowed into the society is dictated by our governments, rather than by the legitimate property owners. Especially since the government owns the roads, this creates a regime of forced association with immigrants, regardless of if there are open borders or closed borders. Perhaps more importantly, when people from the third world immigrate to the West, they bring their tyranny-centric cultures with them, diluting the local libertarian sympathetic culture in favor of the third world. There's a whole body of research about how diversity does not work, and I won't go over that here. But to summarize, if our goal is libertarianism, then it makes no sense to import socialists, especially if we want to maintain a libertarian society. Don't get me wrong, agorism, decentralized means of exchange, are a fantastic way to innovate the state out of existence. But if a large percentage of our government-free society still demands a government, they'll create one, forming their own centralized means of exchange to facilitate the formation of another government if they have to. Alternatively, foreign cultures will completely depopulate their home regions and migrate into the now anarchist society. This is why I say we need a state. Now, a state is not a government. A government is a territorial monopoly on arbitration that gives itself a monopoly on violence. A state is simply a territorial monopoly on arbitration. Why many anarcho-capitalists would use the term interchangeably, I don't understand. The two are nothing alike at all, though in all fairness to them, I did too make that mistake, but I'm better now. So in order to have a state without a government, people will have to organize themselves into covenant communities where homeowners work together and collaborate to provide the goods and services the state would traditionally. Such an organization would naturally be traditionalist, valuing family and family relationships because of reasons. They would form contracts with one another, stipulating that they would have no place in that society if they failed to abide by certain rules, obvious ones, such as violating the non-aggression principle, or more cultural rules for social niches, such as not eating pork in predominantly Jewish covenant communities, for example. But any such community would have to be openly intolerant of anti-libertarian ideas, such as democracy or socialism, advocates for which should be forcibly removed from society, physically if necessary. Similarly, lifestyles damaging to the family are to be regarded with equal hostility, including hedonism, primitivism, paganism, homosexuality, Calvinism, and other degenerate lifestyles. We have to maintain a libertarian social order at all costs. Wait a minute. The model proposed suggests property owners would voluntarily form contracts with their neighbors, stipulating the conditions for which they will voluntarily abandon their own legitimately owned property, or when the neighbors are justified in running them out of town. What purpose is there to a contract where signatories have everything to lose but nothing to gain? The only way this would be possible is if these conditions were hardwired as a condition for property ownership in the first place. Clearly, the whole covenant community would be privately owned, either by a landlord or company. Homes and space within the community are rented, or even leased by a lump sum, and are thus subject to rules dictated by the owners, in exchange for both access to housing and services that the owner provides. Would those conditions for the lease agreement become oppressive or unreasonably expensive? Well, there would be multiple covenant communities in the area, each competing with each other in the libertarian free market, trying to attract as many tenants as possible by offering the most services at the lowest prices, while having the most favorable rules in their lease agreements. One of the stipulations would always be the forfeiture of the lease agreement should the tenant participate in degenerate lifestyles or engage in anti-libertarian advocacy. We have to maintain a libertarian social order at all costs. Wait a minute. Any company that refuses to serve certain classes of people based on arbitrary characteristics, such as race, sex, or even ideology, will be outcompeted by companies that won't discriminate. Segregation by businesses in Jim Crow South would have ended decades earlier had southern states not mandated it by law. Even in a government-restricted, quasi-market economy, discrimination is a terrible business model. This is going to be made even worse in a libertarian free market where customers have more choices and more spending power due to the absence of government economic restrictions and taxation. Thus, any community covenant which refused to serve Democrats or socialists would be bought out by community covenants that did serve them. Community covenants could not even cartelize to prevent this. They may attempt to do so, but all that would do is create incentives for community covenants to break the cartel and earn the revenue of otherwise disenfranchised thought criminals. Why are homeowners associations, which is more or less what a covenant community is, thought policing its members anyways? There is nothing unethical about having disagreeable thoughts or even expressing them. If a libertarian social order is so fragile that the mere physical presence of dissenters is enough to collapse it, then surely such an enterprise is doomed before it can even begin. It's very clear that there's several fundamental flaws with the premise of our society. Monarchism. Forget what I said earlier about not needing a government. Clearly, such petty concerns about the non-aggression principle are outdated, oversimplified, and fundamentally an impediment. There is nothing at all wrong with our proposals, premises, or structures. It's the anarchists, you see. As long as it's in the name of our social order, the ends justify the means. Now, you might be asking yourself, dear viewer, why monarchism and not, say, democracy? Well, fortunately, Our spiritual liege Hans Hermann Hoppe explained in Democracy the God That Failed that monarchism has an undeservedly bad reputation, mostly because the people who wrote the history books are Democrats, whose bias blinds them to the advantages that monarchism has over democracy. You see, a democratically elected president's land is effectively borrowed property. Their ownership of it is limited to predefined terms of a few years, with their only hope of maintaining it being victory in future elections, and that assumes the absence of things like term limits. Thus, their time preference is high time preference. Their incentive is to exploit their lands for their own immediate benefit as quickly as possible and leave the consequences to their electoral successor. Compare a king. The land is effectively his property, and barring revolution or foreign conquest, they can expect to remain secure as the owner, though he cannot reasonably expect to live forever as monarchs are not immortals. His incentive is still to maintain the land and build its value, as his successor will either be a hand-chosen personal friend or his next of kin, to whom the monarch will wish all the best upon. As such, his time preference is low. Low time preference. Okay, first off, who decided that time preferences in economics are measured in terms of verticality? It makes no sense whatsoever. Just say short time preference, short or long. That makes a lot more sense. Time is measured in lengths, not elevation. Since a king's incentive is to maintain, if not increase the value of their property, they will find that degenerate behavior and anti-libertarian thought to be detrimental, since degeneracy leads to ghetto ethics. What are ghetto ethics, you might ask? Shut up. But they ruin property value, and as such, any good king would expel these unwanted brigands from their society. A king can also raise an army in defense of their society should it come under attack. Kings wouldn't want to fight other kings, since people raised to fight in these wars are workers removed from the productive economy, or even potentially killed in war, eliminating their productivity from the economy forever. But more importantly, with decisions about who can and cannot enter into the kingdom being decided by someone else, the average person is freed from political concerns. Tradition would surely again see resurgence, since traditionalism can only improve the value of the land. If anything, the king would be incentivized to mandate traditions if society did not want to do so voluntarily. You might be asking if the king might become despotic, with the entirety of society and the rights of the people subject to the fickle whims and fancies of one man whose judgment may be impaired through propaganda, blackmail, dementia, drunkenness, or even the simple reality that absolute power corrupts absolutely. To that, I reply, shut up. We have to maintain a libertarian social order at all costs. Wait a minute. Historical monarchies were highly repressive, especially in the field of economics. Medieval Europe, for example, embraced mercantilism and the guild system, which saw monarchies giving out monopolies to favored companies or labor unions, then called guilds, and enforcing them through violence. Plus, if our social order or our traditions require a coercive monopoly headed by one dude to threaten people into observing them, then that's a confession of a lack of confidence in our own ideas and traditions. After all, if we're using force, it means that people wouldn't agree voluntarily. Wouldn't that mean that it's not worth maintaining if that's the case? That it's an act of irrationality to force people to do what is demonstrably not in their self-interests, let alone hugely unethical? Also, isn't it hypocritical to create a libertarian society with an absolute monarchy? I have to admit, these questions are giving me pause. You know what? Perhaps we should go back to basics. Figure out what we were trying to do in the first place and work from there. Revise our theory a bit. So the whole point of libertarianism is skepticism of the efficacy of a centralized authority with coercive power. So far so good. And we get it through agorism and decentralizing the means of production and exchange. Good. To maintain a libertarian society, therefore, what we have to do is centralize authority even further. That's right. If you take God Emperor Hans Hermann Hoppe's ideas to the logical conclusion, and he cannot be wrong, he is our immortal God Emperor after all. What we need is a totalitarian fascist state. The state is all there is. The state is all, and we are the state. The state is time and space, and we only exist because of and for the providence of the state. Our rights are bestowed upon us by the grace of our rulers, whose infallible altruism will guarantee they only act in the best interest of our social order. Though I myself will probably not be a ruler, I know with absolute certainty how they will conduct themselves, and I know without a doubt that they will be perfect, incorruptible angels in their pursuit of the common good. They will offer guidance on when to sleep, how long to sleep, what to eat, what to wear, which jobs you shall perform, and for how long, which acts of leisure you shall engage in, and for how long, and so much more. Failure to comply with mandatory guidance may result in 5 years rehabilitation, brought to you by the Ministry of Kindness. Imbeciles, unenlightened by the holy writ of our Lord and Savior Hoppe, will undoubtedly mule pathetically about how our society is a slave state. Remember well, citizen, ethics and morality are an impediment to the great and glorious master of mankind's grand design, and those who appeal to them are blind to how our glorious state keeps us safe from foreign influences and the omnipresent threat of socialist or democrat infiltration, or how the mandate of our perfect tradition benefits society. We have to maintain a libertarian social order at all costs. Wait a minute, I know what you're thinking, that this is beyond ridiculous, creating a totalitarian dictatorship that worships some college professor who has done more damage to the libertarian movement than even the American Libertarian Party, as some sort of god king has completely defeated the purpose of libertarianism. That such a society is the precise opposite of the free country that we should seek to establish, wantonly violating individual rights and treating moral agents as the property of their rulers. Such actions cannot possibly be justified by even a layman's understanding of natural law, let alone from a consequentialist ethical framework, and no sane person in the right mind would unironically call this horror show libertarian. Well, citizen, you do raise an excellent question. But to answer the most important question first, the sentence for thought crime is death. We have to maintain a libertarian social order at all costs.